It's great to welcome to the program today Dean Baker, who's a senior economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, also a visiting professor at the University of Utah. So great to talk to you, Dean.
It's good to be on. Thanks for having me.
So to start with, there's so many areas I'm curious about your take on that are relevant to sort of recent political economic discussions. We could talk about automation. There's the debt and deficit football that is often in the news. There is the discussion of are we heading towards a recession and how would we know when we are in it? But maybe to figure out what you think might be most productive, is there a particular area where you believe that the sort of corporate mainstream discussion and framing of an economic topic is just way off, where we need to completely realign even how we're thinking of the parameters of the debate?
Yeah, there actually is. It's an area that I worked on kind of as a spare time thing for really decades. And this is patent and copyrights. That's going to sound obscure to people, and that's a big problem because patents and copyrights are hugely important in the economy. And just to put it as simply as possible, there's a very commonly held view, certainly among economists and people in policy discussions, that technology is responsible, or at least partly responsible, for upward redistribution of income. So the idea is that you have these people in STEM, people who do computer work, or you could point to a Bill Gates, they get really rich, and it's just because of technology. And then you have the people who have less education. We'll say people will use college degrees as a cutoff. That's still about 2/3 of the workforce who don't have college degrees. And they end up as being losers. So a classic story, someone working on the assembly line at UAW in an auto factory. That used to be a good paying job. You could support a family on it. You have healthcare insurance, a pension. Well, those jobs just aren't that valuable anymore. And the story goes, this is, I might say it's unfortunate, it's technology. And the point about patents and copyrights are those are government policies, and those determine who are the winners, who get the benefits from technology. And just to go back to our friend Bill Gates is incredibly rich because he has copyrights, patents also, on Microsoft software. The government will arrest people who use Microsoft software without his permission. Now, that is a policy. It obviously serves a purpose. We have patents, we have copyrights, provide incentive for innovation, incentive for creative work, but that's a policy to do it. And the point is, they could be stronger, they could be weaker, they could be shorter. We could have weaker penalties, stronger penalties for violating them. And there are alternatives. We already fund an awful lot of creative, innovative work, and most importantly, National Institutes of Health. We could fund more that way.
So, Dean, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. There's this idea when we talk about tech jobs for people with or without college degrees, the sort of potential of these different types of jobs. And very often the sort of fate of those decisions is maybe too much attributed to the choices that the individual makes about going or not going to college, the type of field that they want to work in. But what you're saying is that with regard to the technology, the potential of technology jobs, that rather than being a sort of virtue of the decisions made by the individual, it's the framework established around intellectual property by the government that has kind of created this environment to begin with.
Exactly. So the fact that there's a lot of money in the tech sector, that's a policy decision. And again, you could even say it's a good policy decision. That's fine. But the point was, this didn't just happen. So when we get all these people start going, we really feel bad for those people who are left behind, you go, well, they weren't left behind. We pushed them behind.
I'm curious about, here's an example question that's often asked that we could either answer as asked, or we could point out that the framing is the wrong framing. So there's this question of the gap between CEO pay and average worker pay at corporations. If I ask my former University of Massachusetts economic professor Richard Wolff about what is the correct ratio between CEO pay and average worker pay, he would say the entire system is screwed up. We need to be looking at democratizing the workplace. He would have a systemic critique rather than one of just saying, well, it should be limited to like 100x or something like that. How does someone like you approach a question like that of CEO pay to average worker pay?
Well, I'm fine with the more systemic critique. I'd be fine with having workers have more say in the way companies are run and everything.
Yeah.
But I think there's an important misconception about the current system that, I sort of say, I guess my view is always if you can't take small steps, the idea you're somehow going to take a big leap is, at least to me, fairly unlikely. So one of the points I've made about CEO pay is it's coming at the expense of shareholders. So there was a big deal made about a month or so ago, the Business Roundtable that includes all the major companies, JP Morgan's in there and Bill Gates and Microsoft, all the big companies are in there. They said, oh, we should no longer be concerned with just maximizing shareholder value. We have to be concerned about our workers, about the environment, about the community, which you go, okay, those are all good things. But the point I made was you were not just concerned about maximizing shareholder value. You were concerned about maximizing CEO pay. CEO pay has gone up 940% over the last 4 decades. And, guess what? Returns to shareholders over the last 2 decades actually have been very poor by historic standards. You could argue what they should get. I mean, that's open question. But the point is, returns to shareholders in the last 2 decades have actually been really weak by historic standards. So if they've been maximizing shareholder value, they do a really bad job of it. So my point is that what's going on with CEOs is that basically they're ripping off their shareholders, and that's because of the structure of corporate governance. The people who determine their pay are their boards of directors who are most immediately responsive to the CEOs. So again, I'd be happy to see workers have more say in the way corporations are run, but I would just settle for having shareholders have more say in the way corporations are run because CEOs would get an awful lot less money. And that affects the distribution of wages up and down the economy. Because if the CEO is getting 20 million, in many cases they are, person right underneath them, the chief financial officer, the other top people, they're probably getting 10, 12 million. The third tier is getting 2 or 3 million. And back where I learned my arithmetic, if those people are getting more, everyone else must be getting less because that's taking a big chunk of the corporate pie.
You said something at the beginning of this topic, which is if we can't take small steps, it's not totally logical to think that we could take the really big steps. And this is a conversation I've had very often as someone myself who identifies as a social democrat with those who designate themselves as socialists, who want socialization of the means of production and want to go way further than I want to go. And I've pointed out, it seems to me that in the immediate, what you want is not even a possibility, and that what you want is only going to happen if we first get to what I want. So really, we should be working together rather than disagreeing about what the end point is. Is that a reasonably pragmatic in your mind when it comes to a lot of these economic questions, or am I maybe missing some other component here?
I think that's very, very much on the line, on the mark, because the reality is we could all think of, sort of grand visions that we would like to see the world look like. But those are going to be really, really hard to get to. And if all we're thinking of is the grand vision, well, odds are we're not going to make any progress. And, people are living their lives. And if they go without health care, that's a really big deal. So we could have our grand vision, but they're not getting health care. If we're not doing anything to address climate change, again, we could have our grand vision of what the world should look like. But, if we're obsessed with them, we're not thinking, okay, what can we do tomorrow? What can we do that's going to have an impact? Now, ideally, you have a longer term strategy. So you aren't just doing things randomly like, oh, this is a good thing to do tomorrow. And then, well, something else to do the next day. You do have some framework in which these steps make sense. But to just say, oh, I have my grand vision, end of story, well, then you're going to be talking about your grand vision and basically doing nothing.
I guess to defend the view of those who have a more, you might have to tear it down to build it back up the right way mentality, they would maybe argue that when you look at some of the major economic issues, including, for example, inequality, the disproportionate power of corporations over our daily lives in endless different ways, when you ask what are the really big issues here, it's not crazy to think that unless you really do away with the power structures that got us to where we are, we will never have the bigger change. And maybe that's how someone would defend focusing on the grand vision rather than what we can do right now.
Well, I have to say that one really doesn't make a lot of sense to me because the idea is somehow we're going to have it all come crashing down. I mean, that's I'm sorry, I just think that's crazy wishful thinking. And, at the end of the day, that means we're not doing anything we're not addressing really important issues, so we're going to hope it keeps it will come crashing down. In the meantime, we're going to destroy the planet with, throwing out so much greenhouse gas emissions that I'm not going to say it's never irreversible, but it will devastate, life as we know it. That doesn't make sense to me.
When it comes to the discussions of recession, what is your barometer for determining if an economy is in a recession? Is it that important to make that determination in any kind of definitive way? If qualitatively you can identify things that are going well and things that are not going so well, what's your general sense of the way that discussion has been carried out?
Well, the conventional view of recession, 2 quarters of negative growth, that's not 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. That's not rigorously defined. I mean, in other words, the 2001 recession, we actually didn't have 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. But in any case, to my view, whether we're technically in a recession or not may at the end of the day not be that important, because the big issues are things like, well, basically, do people have jobs? Are people seeing rising real wages? Do people feel they can quit their job if they don't like it? Because there's a strong labor market, they can quit their job and get another job somewhere else. Those are what I think of as big things. And right now, the economy, the labor market looks reasonably good. If it weakens, if we start to see the unemployment rate go up a lot and we start to see wages slow, that's a big problem, whether or not we're in a recession. So whether we could technically say, okay, negative growth, it's a recession, that won't matter if it turns out to be the case that the unemployment rate's rising and workers lose their ability to secure wage gains.
There's this indicator that I've looked a little bit at, which is kind of a proxy indicator to what may be coming, which is the percentage of people who are 90 days or more behind on car payments. The idea being that one's ability to stay current on car payments relates to a lot of other elements of the economy, being able to get to work, which often depends on that job, and that there may be some reasonable way in which it's a proxy indicator to what may be upcoming. Whether or not you want to comment on that particular metric, do you believe that there are advanced metrics that are more relevant to figuring out whether a recession is coming than others? Or is anybody who's telling you these are the three things you want to look at oversimplifying?
Well, when I look back at the recessions post World War II, there are common features. There are basically two stories with post World War II recessions. One is that we start to see higher inflation. The Fed raises interest rates to counter that, tries to slow the economy, and they go too far. So when they raise rates, that causes people to buy fewer cars, buy fewer houses. They stop refinancing mortgages. All those things dampen growth, and if they go too far, then it gives you a recession. The other way you get a recession is when a bubble bursts, and that's, of course, what happened in 2008, 2009, where the housing bubble burst and gave us a very severe recession. That was also really the story of the 2001 recession, that we had the stock bubble burst. And technically, that's not considered a serious recession. I consider it a bad one because if you look at the labor market, we continue to lose jobs. The recession officially ends in December of 2001. We continue to lose jobs all through 2002 and most of the way through 2003. And we didn't get back the jobs we lost until January of 2005. So to my view, that was a serious recession. But long and short, when we're looking for cues, advance warning, the two stories: one, do we have a bubble that's about to burst? And for that, I don't see any bubbles that are driving the economy. And I did see both the stock bubble and housing bubble. So, I do look for things like that. I don't see anything there now. The other story is the Fed raising interest rates aggressively. Well, we never got the interest rate all that high. I know Donald Trump was yelling about it, but the Fed's interest rate never got above 2.5%. They've just lowered it twice. I don't see either story of a recession. So the classic causality for a recession, the Fed or a bursting bubble, it's just not there. So I really don't see one on the horizon.
Looking forward, the topic of automation is getting more and more attention when it comes to the presidential race. It's been mostly Andrew Yang who has been talking about it. And I've read some pieces saying that this is an overblown fear, that in the same way that in the past technology has destroyed some jobs and industries but always created more, that will continue to happen. On the other hand, there are papers I've read which say the rate at which that has happened in the past is changing, and over time, technology will destroy more jobs than the number it creates. Possible to know that at this point in time? What's your sense of the importance of this automation issue?
Well, what I find ironic, and I just did a little paper looking at productivity and the share portion of productivity growth that's going to workers. And first point out is we're actually in a period of extraordinarily weak productivity growth. So for all the talk of automation, if you actually look at the data, we're actually losing jobs to technology at a historically low rate. And I know all these people, I know a lot of people push that argument. They go, oh, we have all this great technology. And maybe it is great, but the fact is it's not affecting the economy. So the idea that we're about to lose all these jobs to technology, I just see basically zero basis for that. And if it did happen, I mean, if we were to see a more rapid rate of productivity growth, that would be great. That would create a possibility of more rapid wage growth. We could work fewer hours. This is a story with basically no reality whatsoever to it. So it's not one of the things that keeps me up at night.
What is the thing that keeps you up at night when it comes to the economy?
Well, I'd have to say with the economy, I don't know whether you want to call it the economy or not. I mean, global warming is a huge, huge issue, and we're doing nothing on it. I mean, Donald Trump seems to think it's a good thing to throw as much greenhouse gases into the environment as possible. And unfortunately, the U.S. is still such a big actor in the world that if we just ignore any efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it makes it a really big problem. And of course, it makes, other countries, obviously are looking to us and not, you could say as a leader. But the other point is, well, if we're out there spewing as much greenhouse gases as we can into the atmosphere, it probably doesn't make sense for, a France or Germany or UK to do anything because it won't matter. So that is, to my view, far and away the most pressing thing. And I'm hugely concerned about inequality. And, what bothers me is we don't discuss the issue the right way. I was going on about patents and copyrights. I raised this with Economist, and they look at me blank-faced. And it's not that I think economists are brilliant people, but this is their topic. And the idea that we can't, they'll give me this story about, upward redistribution of income. That's unfortunate, but that's just technology. And they go, well, suppose we didn't have patents and copyrights. And then look at me. Well, if we didn't have patents and copyrights, we'd have no incentive. I go, okay, fine. But then you just told me that's a policy. So, but anyhow, there's a tendency just to treat it as this blob that like, oh, we have inequality and it's really unfortunate. Even people on the left, I mean, they want to have progressive taxes, which I think are great, but they treat the underlying cause of inequality as being something that's intrinsic to the market as opposed it was how we structured the market.
Yeah, and it's amazing how, I mean, when you talk about economics, invariably climate change comes up. When you talk about national security, invariably climate change comes up, and it's an issue with far-reaching tentacles for sure. We've been speaking with economist Dean Baker, who's a senior economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, also a visiting professor at the University of Utah. Dean, I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks a lot for having me on. I really enjoyed the discussion.